Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Future Media podcast. Today, I'm thrilled. This has taken some months to set up, but I'm joined today by Patrick McGee, the author of this book. So many of you will already know that I've been really focused on Apple's exposure in China and how it's so reliant on China for its manufacturing, but also reliant on Taiwan, of course, for its chips. And we've just seen Apple's latest record earnings. Are there any other kind of reporting, more record earnings? And so I thought it would be amazing to get Patrick on to talk about that and to talk about the thesis that I'm really interested in. I know he's done some amazing reporting on, which is around Apple's growing advertising business. So Patrick, thanks so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Ricky.
Mate, it's amazing. So you're in San Francisco, but you were the Apple reporter for the FT for a couple of years, if I'm right.
Yeah, for 4 years. I like to say that the book came out of covering three beats at the Financial Times. So I was first there in Hong Kong. I was living in New York, but they hired me to take a position in Hong Kong. And then I was in Germany, largely covering the Volkswagen scandal, but also just German industry, right? So I was sort of
People
in
have
and out of
forgotten the
factories.
Volkswagen scandal.
Well, I haven't. But just in and out of factories and understanding supply chains. I hadn't understood the most basic thing, which is that like a Volkswagen, even a Porsche, doesn't actually really build a lot of the car, right? There's just like a whole network of component makers and so forth. And maybe Porsche does 25% of the car and then they do all the assembly. It's not so different from how phones are made. But I just didn't know that at the time. This was 10 years ago. And then I covered Apple for 4 years, right? So you sort of couple the three things together in a sense, Hong Kong, if not just like Greater China, German supply chains, and Apple, the origins of Apple in China are really the three of those beats coming together.
And before that, you were at the Wall Street Journal, right?
Was a bond reporter, yeah.
Interesting. All right. So you're not so much a tech reporter or a business reporter, you're almost a supply chain expert. Is that fair?
I'm a generalist. There's a book I love by David Epstein called Range, and it's something like how to survive as a generalist in a world of specialists, right? Because my degree is in religion, and I have another degree, a master's in global diplomacy. So I'm sort of all over the map. And in a sense, writing the book was kind of great because it forced me to focus for a 2 year period. And in a way, the only reason I could even convince myself that it was okay to focus and not sort of follow all my interests for 2 years was that the topic was the world's most valuable company, and specifically its relationship to, probably the world's most opaque and at the time most, largest populace, second biggest GDP in the world kind of thing. So it was like, if I'm ever bored of, talking to engineers or studying Apple history, I'll just study Chinese history for a couple of weeks. Like I don't like limiting the things that I'm interested in, but the result of that is it can feel very scattershot, like I'm never really learning anything in too much depth, and I honestly think like information overload is probably like my biggest intellectual problem.
You and I are going to get on famously because every time I decide to go and write a story about Apple, it's never a story about business or about phones. It's about something far more. It's about trust or privacy or
Yeah.
philosophy or design, even love, even. Apple's a very interesting and seemingly unique company that's managed to blend all these things together with a visionary leader, then replaced by kind of a supply chain efficiency guy in Tim Cook. But
Yeah.
what fascinated me when I started to dive under the covers of Apple as a company, and it's how I got to meet you, was because I started writing articles about how exposed Apple was to China and to Taiwan and the geopolitical tensions between America and there. And as I started to do this, I wrote a couple of pieces about it, and everybody sent me a copy of your book and said, "You got to read this. You got to read this. This guy's thinking about all the same things." So, pray see your book for me. Tell me what was your takeaway from that? Because on one level, it looks like an incredible success story of visionary, efficient business building. On the other
Mhm.
side, it looks like the world's most valuable company was exposed to incredible geopolitical downrisk.
Yeah, well, it's a story where their greatest strength, which is not imagining products. I think that was the Steve Jobs strength, but actually building them at just like mind-bogglingly large scale. Because that scale is so focused and concentrated in a single country and a country that has become America's biggest geopolitical rival over the last 10 years, it sort of means that their greatest strength is also their greatest weakness, right? Their success has become their vulnerability. So, like in the latest quarter, right, that just came out, Chinese sales jumped 38%.
Yeah.
I mean, that's wild, but that their success in China doesn't sort of say like, oh, well, all is well in China. In China, it's quite the opposite. It's like, oh, they're even deeper in the country, right? Because if you're doing that well in China, are you going to make active steps to decouple and sort of do more in India? Like you'd be giving up a $70 billion business that's growing in double digits. It's like there were years, 2010 to 2015, where China was by far the biggest driver of the company's revenue growth, right? And it's like they're back there again right now. And obviously that's great in a business sense, but it's sort of not great in a geopolitical sense. I mean, imagine Donald Trump reading the results. Do you think he wants to see that they're doing extremely well because Chinese people are buying so many of their phones? Like, it's not really what he wants to see.
Yeah, it's not making America great again, is it? And so I think that you're absolutely nailing it. So the iPhone is like ubiquitous in America, right? It's a huge market for consumers. Everyone's got an iPhone, right? It's different in other global markets, but in America, the iPhone's enormously important. Everyone's got one. But I don't think many people realize that the chips come from Taiwan and the manufacturing is done mainly in China, right?
That's a good question. I think before 2022, or maybe even before COVID, I don't think the chips thing would have been known. People's comprehension of what chips are and how they fuel the entire modern world, I just don't think was that sophisticated. But there were so many stories during COVID. The book Chip War by Chris Miller, I think had just like a huge influence on people. And then the rise of companies like Nvidia, becoming $5 trillion company, overtaking Apple. I think people have really sort of yeah, I think you find fewer oohs and ahs if you're talking to an audience of wealth managers or whatever. If you're talking about TSMC having 90% of advanced semiconductor production in the world, even fab versus fabless, I don't think was well understood before 2020 by average people. So that one, but the phones are built in China. I mean, everybody knows that, I would say. They just don't know what it means to have them built in China. They can't imagine the scale of the factories and the story, I think, and I probably mentioned this on like page 3. The story has always, since 2006, been Apple is exploiting Chinese workers, right? And this is Ricky
Yes.
Gervais jokes at the Academy Awards. This is the stuff of Saturday Night Live skits. So that's all really well known. I mean, the products for the longest time literally said, designed in California, made in China on the back. Now it's just on the box. But my thesis, of course, is that Apple didn't find the tech competence in China. It literally built the tech competence in China by sending over quite literally plane loads of engineers, and the aggregate thousands of engineers per year to hundreds of factories in the country to train them up to Apple quality and then help them scale at enormous quantity and to do so at almost no margin, right? Which allowed them, if you're either going to run with Apple and become a world-class business, or you'd just be roadside roadkill. I'm trying to say. So that's where their influence ends up being enormous, and I think the narrative is able to really flip the usual sort of narrative on its head. That this is not a story about Apple exploiting China. This is a story of China realizing we can exploit Apple.
Right. Amazing. So there's a piece in your book that really stuck in my mind. There was you tell it, but there was a guy from Apple. They were flying entire plane loads. In fact, they actually chartered, I think the airline put planes on because there were so many execs flying over, right? Is that right?
This is in 2014 and 2016. Apple convinces United Airlines, or their preferred airline, to begin flying to two different Chinese cities that United essentially had no interest in flying to. And Apple was able to say, look, we're going to book so many first class seats if you start going one way, or sorry, direct from San Francisco to Chengdu and Hangzhou. 3 times a week, that even if the rest of the plane is empty, you'll still make money.
That's wild. So they have set their sights on we are doing this. And then you told the story. The story that really stuck in my brain was they'd gone and partnered up with a local businessman, a very ambitious local businessman that was going to help them build their supply structure. And they needed a factory. And the guy said, "Oh, here's your factory." And it was a field. And they were
Yeah,
like, "What
field of
happened?"
garbage. Yeah.
So tell that story.
I think this is for the iPod Nano. This is one of Foxconn's maybe not first major projects with Apple, but it's at a time when Foxconn's a little bit worried that they're sort of being sidelined in favor of these other Taiwanese contract manufacturers. And they make a big play to make the iPod mini. It goes really well. And then the following year, they're going to build the iPod Nano. If people don't remember the Nano, I mean, it is still an extraordinary device by today's standards, right? This was 2 decades ago, but I mean, it was just this tiny, remarkable device with a really lucid color screen. I mean, people that didn't understand that Apple was going to get into the phone market and that they were going to wipe the competition. Yeah, all you had to do is really examine the Nano, because if you remember Nokia phones back then, they were just sort of like these shitty plastic devices that were glued together, and by
Yeah.
that standard, like the Nano looked like it came from another planet. Anyway, yeah, so John Rubinstein, who was a senior vice president at the time, sort of goes to China and meets Terry Guo, the founder of Foxconn, an instrumental company in Apple's success, and points to a field of garbage and says, "There's your iPhone, there's your iPod factory." And Rubinstein's told the story to a few people, to be fair, but he basically said like he had a heart attack on the spot. Like, the fact this is like I think February, and they're supposed to be turning them out for the holiday season, so they need to be building like literally about 1 million a day by November. And he's looking at a factory that just a field of garbage. When he comes out a few weeks later, maybe it's a few months later, it's like steel girders, right? So it's sort of like the skeleton of a factory. And then eventually he's able to walk up some stairs when it's still steel girders, and there's the second floor alone is what's finished, but not the rest of the factory. And so every time he goes there, just over the course of a few months, the progress that's being made is just absolutely astounding. And it's just this one of these examples where Terry Guo just knew exactly what China was capable of. It's worth knowing Terry Guo is not Chinese; he's Taiwanese, but he's able to sort of take advantage of the special policies being taking place in places like Shenzhen to get this stuff up and running, and largely taking care of the politics on behalf of Apple for a solid 13-year period.
And so your take in your book, your conclusion is that, to your point, general consensus around the world was Apple's taking advantage of China and using cheap labor to, ensure it retains huge margins on its phones. But what was actually happening was a lot of the IP of what Apple was doing and a lot of the skills involved in building the world's best phones were effectively being taught to a Chinese workforce that could then reuse those skills to start their own smartphones. And of course, now we know that manufacturers like Huawei and others are really competing.
In some sense, the book's large claims sound deeply counterintuitive. And often when I try to explain the impact of Apple and I compare it to a nation building effort, you get this like aghast response from people. They think it just sounds absolutely nuts. I really haven't had anyone who's finished the book and isn't convinced, because it all comes together pretty seamlessly, right? Like the dots are just connected in ways that I didn't imagine when I started the project, but it just begins to make so much sense when you recognize that Apple is by far the biggest hardware company in the world, in the sense that you cannot find me another company with north of $400 billion of revenue. 80% of that revenue is hardware, and 90% of that hardware is coming out of China. Like, it's just not an arbitrarily chosen company. Yeah. Samsung or whoever just doesn't fit the bill in that way. Tim Cook's own estimate for how many people in China work in the supply chain on an annual basis is 3 million people, right? And so, yeah, so the number of people they've trained since 2008, this is a number that Apple discloses, is 30 million. So I compare that to being greater than the labor force of California, greater than the labor force of Australia. And the investments they're making in China are so large that I couldn't find any corporate equivalent. And so I had to go to nation building efforts on behalf of a superpower like America. And you realize that in a 5-year period from 2015 to 2021, their investments were double that of the Marshall Plan when you equate it to 2015 dollars. And people, by the way, it's a great, I think, turn of reference just to get people to understand the gargantuan effort involved. But what people seem to never actually do is extrapolate from there. Because I don't do it for you, because I want to stick with the documents I have. But the Marshall Plan comparison is only a 5-year period. But of course, Apple's been in China doing the training hundreds of factories since around 2003 is when the consolidation happens. 2000 is when they first go to China. So if you just sort of take 22% of revenue, which in 2015 was $55 billion, and that I have like an Apple document for, and you just sort of run the Excel figures from, let's say, the birth of the iPhone through 2025, Apple's invested around $1 trillion in the country. So, I mean, it's just absolutely wild versus what the Taiwanese have invested or what the Japanese have invested. And books have been written on those subjects, but not on Apple. So that was sort of the impetus for the book.
Amazing. Fantastic research. And so Apple's now I'm not sure what its market cap is this morning.
Roughly $4 trillion.
$4 trillion company. listed in America, but 51% of its earnings, according to the latest quarter, came from the iPhone. About 70% of its production is in China. A significant chunk of its earnings is in China. Its growth is in China. It's more a Chinese company than an American company, isn't it? If you're being provocative.
Let me actually sort of defend Apple on this front, just because I don't want to be a journalist that sort of just looks like they're taking open shots or something. The whole basis of there being American companies that are global multinationals, this isn't something Tim Cook or Steve Jobs came up with. This was very much a Washington directive where we were going to sort of integrate the world through commerce, right? And so when Apple is making moves to go to China for their production in the early 2000s, they're late to the party. HP had been doing that since like 1985 or so. Motorola, at least a decade before them. And so, the idea was that that's how you were going to integrate the world and sort of make a world peaceful, right? This is Pax Americana. And I think you can make the argument, and many people have, that the modern birth of democratic governments in Taiwan, West Germany, and then all of Germany, Korea, and Japan are largely the result of this idea, right? The interdependence of manufacturing and these trade nodes. And, largely the Soviet Union fell because it wasn't a part of this dynamic economy. So if there was a major mistake, it was thinking that you could apply the same idea to a proud country with a 5,000-year history and 4 times the American population. I mean, China just had no interest in sort of being subservient to that sort of model, even though it served them really well. So that was, in a sense, the mistake. Although I want to be careful there. You also, that the idea of having China join the WTO has resulted in hundreds of millions of people being lifted out of poverty, and that's obviously a net good. So the problem is really only contentious when you have Xi Jinping take power and really take the country in a more belligerent, hostile direction. And then you sort of have a geopolitical wake up, right? Where what does it mean for us to be, in a sense, building up the prowess of this country? If you're thinking about the people, it's great. If you're realizing that actually what we've done is sort of solidified the communist hold over that country, maybe it's not so good. And not to get too biting here, but the original Marshall Plan, of course, is about investing in Europe to sort of ward off the communist threat. And the Tim Cook Plan, if you will, is very much to ingratiate the company with communist leadership. So it's the money of the Marshall Plan, but with the optics or with the strategy inverted.
Amazing. Fantastic. Read the book, people. It's amazing. But I do want to move on to two slightly but associated things. I want to talk about a little bit about people, okay? And I want to talk about products a little bit. So let's talk about people first. There's been a lot of reporting. We've got a tariffs war at the moment between the West and the East, between China and America. There are chip challenges. What do you think it's going to mean for consumer prices? Do you think that there's going to be an impact?
That's a good question. I mean, you're already seeing price impact in terms of memory, right? Apple's had to call that out in their latest earnings. I mean, I guess you have to put it this way. If your push is just to efficiency and you're not considering really anything else, but just doing the sort of quarterly earnings, what do we do for efficiency? I mean, you're going to go to China. And not only are you going to go to China, and this is what's happened with Apple, you're going to rely more and more on Chinese companies operating within China rather than global multinationals operating within China. Because increasingly under Xi Jinping, it's the homegrown companies that can get the right subsidies, support, all sorts of things, right? This is where the rise of the red supply chain. That's the Taiwanese term for the local mainland competitors to the Taiwanese suppliers or assemblers. So, if you're going to build resiliency into the supply chain, inherently that's going to cost more. And if you live in a world without political conflict, then that's always going to look bad, right? But then when something like COVID happens, it's always going to look good. It's like an insurance policy to say we've got 3 different suppliers for X, Y, and Z. I can say Z with you, I suppose, right? I'm Canadian, you're Australian, but I'm in San Francisco. I always have to say Z. Right? So my point is, it's not so easy to just say, well, it costs more to build resiliency because it's like saying it costs more to insure my house. Well, that's true, but in the case of a fire, it costs less, right? So you don't know the future.
Fair.
Yeah.
How exposed is Apple if China invades Taiwan? Okay, so we have this dispute. How serious is that? Because pretty much the brains of Apple's phones all come from there.
Yeah, not even just its phones, right? Like we're talking about a singular island is responsible for basically all chipsets powering everything from AirTags to every Mac you can think of and AirPods and everything else, right? They used to have a more diversified set where they relied on Intel, and Intel was based out of America and Israel for its fabs. So everything's really concentrated into TSMC, right? It's not even just an island, but like some, I think six fabs in particular from TSMC. So look, I've described it like it would be a meteor strike on Apple's business if that were to happen. And I'm not trying to be cute about this, but the silver lining would be that if China were actually to blockade Taiwan or, uh, actually go to war and take over the island, where you get your next iPhone would not be in your top 2 dozen concerns, right? I mean, living on a coastal in the coastal United States, I would worry about San Francisco being bombed or something, right? I mean, we're talking about such consequential things
You
that.
might be if you're heavily invested in Apple stock. I mean,
Oh yeah, look.
the impact goes down right through the economy. It'll affect people's car insurance. It'll affect
Oh my
people's
God, but that's my
investment.
point. It affects so many things that Apple share price. That's just not going to be the big concern. But I'll say two things about that. One is that Warren Buffett once invested, maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, about $5 billion into TSMC, and within a few months, he actually took every penny out. And he was asked about it, and he said something along the lines of, "Love the company, don't like the location," and so I reconsidered. And during the writing of my book, he divested, and he's sorry, Apple's number one singular
Yeah,
investor. He divested about 2/3 of his stake in Apple. He has not really disclosed why. And I suppose the most generous interpretation would be, well, look, he's sort of preparing to hand over the reins, or maybe he even has at this point. And so I think he's named the person. And so, he just wants to have sort of cash-rich company to hand over and give the next person his due. Sure. Or the TSMC logic that he was sort of explicit about, he recognizes that it's one-to-one accurate for Apple as well.
yeah,
The other thing I would say is I quote Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times saying TSMC is probably the first company in history where, were it to stop producing tomorrow, the entire world would fall into recession. Right?
exactly.
It is arguably the most important company in the world. It is the chip producer for any major company you can think of: Google, Nvidia, Apple. The list goes on.
Which means that it is the epicenter of AI now.
Yes, it absolutely is.
All right, interesting. Well, fascinating. So I want to talk a little bit about publishing because a lot of the people on here are publishers, and one of the things that leapt out for me in the report, in the financial announcements, was just how reliant now Apple is becoming on advertising. Now, I think for most people, advertising and Apple are two things that you wouldn't ever put together. Don't do that. They don't do that. It involves knowing your privacy. They don't do that. But they do. They have quite a large advertising business, and 3 times they called out the growth of their advertising business. Now, interestingly enough, as we were getting to know each other, you've been involved in reporting on Apple's advertising in the past. So please share and maybe explain to people, what you learned then, and we can bring it up to date with the numbers in the latest report.
So I'll try to keep this short, but when I was covering Apple for the Financial Times, I wasn't always doing a very good job. It's a very difficult company to follow. And they don't help you, right? They like they're not going to sort of they're very controlling of their narrative, right? I think you'll get that even if you're a consumer watching their presentations, right? And so they don't, in a certain sense, respect journalists who are trying to tell a different narrative. You can imagine what they think of the book. And so advertising was actually the first time where I ended up having a bunch of Apple scoops, and it's because they introduced this privacy policy, and it really kneecapped the likes of Meta, Facebook, Instagram, who rely on sort of understanding what the user is looking at on their phone, how long they're looking at an ad on Instagram, and then tailoring things to that person, right? And Apple basically just started to disallow that, or at least force them to ask permission from users. And it was kind of maybe ignored's a little bit
Just to
harsh.
be clear, Patrick,
Yeah.
this was the pop-up that said,
Yeah.
do you want your usage to be tracked? Are you happy for your data to be
Yeah,
tracked?
like really aggressive language. And then they had their own personalized ads that had nothing along those lines, right? In terms of it was more inviting. And anyway, my point is just that if you understand how journalists work, journalists cover a beat. And basically, for me, I was realizing the Apple reporters weren't really covering this, or they were maybe they're covering the news announcement. They weren't covering the implications. And the social media reporters, like who I was working with at the FT, they weren't really covering it either because it hadn't quite hit yet, right? Like it's going to take some months before the privacy policy feeds into earnings and stuff. So there was a particular multi-month period where I began to do the reporting on like how is this actually going to impact the likes of Meta, right? And was able to write a story that they were going to lose $10 billion a year from that. And that we published that story on the front page 4 months before it actually happened. And at the same time, Apple was sort of filling the gap. In other words, they were heightening their own advertising ambitions that had always been dormant. And I quoted someone, I think I reused this in the introduction of the book, saying that like in a matter of 6 months, Apple's going to go in advertising from playing in the minor leagues to winning the World Series. I mean, I believe the figures were something like Apple made around $1 billion of advertising revenue in 2019, and the projection was that they'd have about $30 billion by around now. I actually don't know entirely if that's panned out, but
Yeah, but
it's like open season for them. Yeah.
so if you look at this, so Apple, like, as you say, hide the numbers in the most interesting numbers they hide. So they have this, they have iPhone, they tell you about that, Mac, they tell you about that, iPad, they tell you about that, wearables, they tell you about that. And then
Yeah.
everything else goes into services. Yeah.
Yes.
So the $20 billion they're paid by Google, that goes in services. So you can't see it, right? Cloud, that's enormously important because that's how we're index linked directly to AI valuations. That's going to hide in services. Let's put it down there. Oh, and advertising. Where's that? Let me think. Oh, yeah, that'll be in the services, right?
Well, and you're missing the best part about this too, which is that this sounds a little bit like a conspiracy theory, but I think people have mentioned this to me, not from Apple, but I think they're right about it, that the whole origin of Apple TV Plus, in other words, the idea of them getting into making movies, making Ted Lasso, that kind of stuff, is that then when they talk about services, they're like, here's how many Emmys we've been nominated for, right? Here are the shows, and let us show you an upcoming clip from Ted Lasso or whatever. And hey, we're going to do some stuff with Major League Baseball or whatever. In other words, it's they need to fill a narrative every time they're doing earnings that they don't want to say Google's paying us $20 billion a year. I mean, that's something Apple's only acknowledged under oath. Certainly doesn't come up in the
And
earnings
tried
calls.
really hard not to in the court case. The first 2 days was it
Exactly.
not to.
So I don't know if you call it a bait and switch or something like that, but the whole point of services, or rather the TV shows, is that they're not making any real money there, right? At best, it's probably break even. But it plays such an instrumental role for the Apple narrative of here are all the sexy stars. You know, they'd much rather talk about Jennifer Aniston for a few minutes being in a new show than we're squeezing thousands of suppliers and making more money from them this quarter.
So there was a big glitzy announcement of an F1 tie-up, right? After the movie. So that was
Yeah.
this year. That was this year's jazz hands announcement in the services bracket. Well, we should actually start tracking them for every services announcement. You know, what have they announced this time? But what I find fascinating about the advertising businesses is that Apple is a privacy company and sets great store on it. It has been what Apple is about forever. It's why you pay 50% more or 60% more for an iPhone than you do for an Android phone, because you know an Android phone is Google. But when you dive under the cover of this advertising business, you'll find, or all of the business, there are more and more and more and more connections between Google and Apple. Okay. So we found out about Google paying Apple $20 billion to be its default search engine, but we only found out about it in a hotly contested antitrust trial, okay, where it all came out. And that had never been reported. For all of your efforts and my efforts, now we had a number attached to it now. And that number was only from 2022. Okay. So, you know, that's going to be a big number today. And then they're allowed to continue doing that. Then just this week, last week, we saw that Google is now partnering with Apple to use its AI to power Siri and Apple Intelligence, which are probably the most biggest strategic announcements Apple has made in the last 6-8 months. It's AI play, right? So that's mission critical, but that's Google as well. And then when you get into the advertising business, which I'm going to be reporting on, when you dive down all the way through it, it turns out that Google's ad business is plugged into the back end of that Apple business. So everywhere you go, when you pull up the kind of covers, you're finding Google all over the shop. That feels like another strategic risk to me, given its entire brand is, we don't do that.
It's wild for several reasons. One is that Steve Jobs, sort of in his dying days, declared quote unquote thermonuclear war against Google because he hated Android so much, just thought it was a complete copy and paste of what Apple had done over several years. So that's fascinating just because they've gone from almost thermonuclear war to cozy business partners. Secondly, Apple, as you say, talks about privacy so much, but actually, in a sense, the biggest company involved in what has been called surveillance capitalism is Google. So Apple sort of has like a little bit of distance between itself and Google, and yet, yeah, I mean, you go down a layer, and actually they're being paid for to allow Google to run that business on Apple devices. So that's fascinating. Um, and there's more. The other thing is just that because iOS versus Android are in effect the only alternatives in the platform wars, you would think Apple would want to choose someone like Anthropic for its AI because why would they want to be supporting, right? Because in this case, they're not getting money from Google. They're actually paying to rely on Gemini. So in the same sense that Meta doesn't want to be in direct competition doesn't want to rely on OpenAI, for instance. What do I think I'm actually getting this wrong. Right? Most people are relying on GPUs. Google relies on their own tensor processing
Yep.
units, right? TSUs.
Correct.
But now I feel like I'm failing to connect the dots here, where there was an interesting example of someone that didn't want to be relying on NVIDIA. Would that be Google? Didn't want to rely on NVIDIA because they were going after their own TSUs.
Correct. So
Yeah.
Google's chip, there's a chip war as well going on, right?
Yes.
So Google's chips are TSUs. They are the most efficient for creating AI. NVIDIA's overtaken Google, overtaken Apple, overtaken everyone to become a $5
Yeah.
trillion company. But they are building GPUs which are built for gaming. TPUs are built exclusively for AI
True.
and again owned by Google. But what you're seeing is Google's AI capabilities are accelerating very quickly. So it was in probably third place, then second place. It's now overtaken OpenAI. A lot of people are factoring in value. They're reporting their numbers right now. So, we're starting to see the value of Google rising again as it's starting to hit its chops in AI. But the idea that there are only really two smartphone operating systems in the world. There's iOS, which is Apple, and there's Android, which is Google. And if you add the two together, they come to 99% of all smartphones in the world. All right. Now, all of those smartphones after this deal is going to have Google in its guts.
Yes.
And I think that feels like another monopoly. So Google's got a monopoly on app stores, a monopoly on search, it's got a monopoly on advertising, and now it's got a monopoly on smartphones. Where does this end?
Yeah, I don't know. It's wild. I mean, the other interesting thing, and just to throw this out there because I'm the author of Apple in China, but that 1% that's not iOS or Android, that's going to expand, I think, pretty rapidly. I mean, this is obviously just a guess on my part, but Harmony OS is the fast
It's
growing
Huawei, right?
alternative from Huawei. And I've made this guess public. I would reckon, put it this way, I'll be surprised if by 2030, Harmony OS hasn't sort of been franchised off into the de facto Chinese alternative for all smartphones built in the country. Right? Why would they want to have any dependence on anything coming out of Google? Obviously, iOS is not an alternative for them. And then the question, if that happens, is do they begin exporting that, right? So when Huawei is in markets like Western Europe or wherever, where Huawei used to be quite big, are they going to be running Harmony OS? And will consumers be okay with that if they are?
So ultimately, let's round this up because this is big stuff, right? It's really big. It bends your brain. If you're a consumer, you have less and less and less choice. There is less and less choice on pricing. There's less and less choice on privacy. The big tech companies are all in cahoots with each other. You're using NVIDIA chips or you're using Google chips, right? And they're built in China and they're built in Taiwan and they're in iPhones and they're in Android phones. And the whole of AI that everybody's building is all reliant on the chips and the same tech companies. And these five tech companies are going to Mars. Forget the moon. They're way past that. They're off to Mars, okay? What does it mean ultimately, do you think? Make a prediction, just we'll leave it here, but what's your prediction on where this ends? Are we in early stage new capitalism or late stage end capitalism and monopoly? It feels like the Gilded Age, for heaven's sake.
Well, put it this way, I'm much more focused on the concentration of hardware production in China than I am in the issues we just mentioned. All of those are important, but at the end of the day, you're talking about two Western companies vying it out. Whereas in the case of China, um, if for whatever reason China decides to stop building for Apple, right, cancels its license for export or something like that, that's just far more existential, right? So there's something uncomfortable about the duopoly between Google and Apple, and how the links go further than just the superficial ones. But much more concerning is that the Chinese smartphone makers that you don't even see in America, I don't frankly know if you see them on Australia, have total dominance in places like India, Russia, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, etc., right? Markets where Apple barely exists. There are no American or Canadian smartphone makers, right? I'm mentioning Canadian because of BlackBerry. So the sort of dominance in hardware is something that I'm so much more focused on, because we sort of in the West writ large, even if you include India, do not have the capacity, or it's a combination of knowledge, but really it's the execution, right? The scale to compete. I think that's problematic in peacetime, but my God, it's existential in wartime. If you think about China's capacity to build drones and things like that, the West has just given away their capabilities over the last 4 decades of outsourcing, right? We sort of chased profits, whereas China chased capabilities. And in the long term, I think capabilities matter a lot more than ephemeral profits.
I can't build on that, Patrick. That is amazing. I really hope we get to talk again. This is really, really fascinating, mate. Thank you so, so much for investing your time. And are you working on something else? You got another book coming?
I would love to write another book, but it's not like in pitch stage or anything like that. So, yeah, I have some ideas, but nothing public.
All right, buddy. Thank you so much for joining. It's been amazing. Thank you.
Cheers, Ricky. That was good. Thank you. Yeah, I have written a 5,000 word epilogue, and that comes out in